Hello and welcome to Sustain. It's the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Are we actually truckers? What kind of long haul are we doing here? I've never really asked or clarified that. I'm very excited to have our guests on the platform today. I'm your host today. Richard Littauer is my name. Hello, everyone. Great to be here. And I'm joined by Sean Goggins. Sean is a professor at the University of Missouri. He's calling today from his home in Missouri. Sean, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Richard. Great to see you.
I run into you all the time, but we haven't spent a ton of time just talking face-to-face about open source.
No.
So I'm really excited about this conversation. Sean, you sort of exist in this liminal space of open source community making where I also throw a few other people into the space with you. You have Matt Germonprez and you have Georg Link, two people who I always think, oh, those are the Sean people. Don Foster might also be included, but Don, of course, lives in London. For listeners who don't know those people, I think we've had all of them on the podcast. You can go to podcast.CHAOSS.org and look up Georg, Matt Germonprez with the Z at the end, and Don Foster. But Sean, you are your own person. You are your own unique thing. So tell me about you. What do you do at the University of Missouri?
I'm a computer science professor. I teach courses on software engineering, algorithms, advanced algorithms, data structures, data analysis, visualizations. I created a data science master's program now going back 7 years ago. I've been at the University of Missouri for 11 years, 12 almost.
Are you tenure track?
I'm actually a tenured full professor at this stage of my career. So that's pretty good, I guess. Happy in my little cocoon here. I love working with my students. I love teaching. I love the engagement with open source. The work that I get to do is just really a privilege. I think anybody who's ever gone down that track, well, we've always looked at it as most people don't get to focus on the thing they want to focus on in their life for work every day. And so as long as this ride lasts, it's more time than most people ever get. So I don't worry about anything because I'm just living a pretty great experience here. I have a lot of opportunity and I really do get to do and look at the things that interest me.
Reasons to be grateful. That's exciting and really cool. Tell me about where you focus on open source in your work. Is that your main focus? And if so, what part of it?
Open source is my primary research focus for sure. And in my case, it goes back all the way to 2010, which is 15 years ago now, which is really hard to believe. It began when a new PhD student, Nora McDonald, who is now, I think, at James Madison University, came to my office and said, hey, have you heard of GitHub? I've really started looking into it and there's all these interesting characteristics of it and I'd like to do a study. And so we started doing some research together on open source, really exploring how different kinds of projects in the open source universe operationalize different forms of leadership. And we looked at highly centralized leadership projects that welcomed new people in, projects that sustained themselves by isolating a core set of contributors and accepting very few contributions from the outside, and just trying to understand this through the lens of a lens we ended up selecting was something called distributed leadership, which I think exists in most of open source, where there's really not often, not never, but not often a single individual who drives an entire project. Leadership through most successful open source projects is distributed across many people. It's governed by a community in many cases, if not a community in the cases of projects that have a very centralized model that don't accept a lot of contributions. There's usually an organization behind it or some kind of corporation that's really trying to drive a specific agenda with it. And often these projects are UI frameworks where they're very particular and they have to operate in a certain way, and there's not a lot of room for creativity or learning the whole thing.
Hearing you talk about distributed leadership reminds me of governance patterns and reminds me of ways of doing open source well. Now, you've been very involved with the CHAOSS project. Tell me how studying distributed leadership with Nora McDonald led to CHAOSS.
Kind of interestingly, I would call it a circuitous route. I was at Drexel University when I worked with Nora, and I moved on from Drexel University in 2013 to come to the University of Missouri. I had this idea of I wanted to create a data science program for undergraduates, ended up creating a master's degree instead. That's a separate long story. And getting involved in CHAOSS was really Matt and I were collaborating. We met in 2012 at a workshop at the University of Maryland and began working on a project that ended up getting funded by NSF, and it was called the Open Collaboration Data Exchange. OCDX is the now dormant organization on GitHub. And our idea was, in the context of research, there's a replication gap in the conduct of research. And our aim was to define not only the data that is behind a paper, but also all of the software and the versions of the software that were used to produce a particular scientific result. Recognizing that if I used version 2.1 of something, I could possibly get a different result than if I used version 2.7, and that keeping track of all of these versions and what ended up in a paper was an important piece of replication. And so we ended up having a series of workshops and created a series of repositories to try to articulate just examples of how a researcher might catalog that full pipeline, including the data and the software. And in the course of that work, we were both obviously also working in open source to different extents. And Matt and Georg were actually at the Community Summit for the Linux Foundation, which has also been called the Maintainers Summit, and I think the Leadership Summit at various times. It's had a number of different names. I think it's called the Leadership Summit now. And it was a Linux Foundation event. It still exists. And there was a birds of feather session pertaining to metrics that I think was Georg's idea. And the birds of a feather session got a just tremendous response. And I can still recall, it was about this time of year, and I was on spring break. And Matt called me and said, we just had this workshop with Georg, and people were so interested in it. It kind of builds on the things that we were doing with the OCDX, but more of a software part of it, really less concerned with the data, more concerned with the software. And we got really excited. And I think within a few months, we had a project. I think we were the 59th project in the Linux Foundation, which right at this stage, I think is over 1,000 projects. So we were early on in the Linux Foundation's project blooming, and it kind of came together. We formed the CHAOSS organization with the Grimoire Lab folks and went from there. And that was in 2017, and things have just kind of continued. And there's a whole long story.
So there is a long story. You can find more of that on chaos.community. There's a ton of different working groups. There's a podcast, which is also hosted by Sustain. We also use the same editor, Paul. If you've never heard me wax poetic about my podcast editor, send me an email whenever you like. Paul is the best. And Sustain has often done a lot of things with CHAOSS as well, like joint workshops and the like, and tends to be really awesome people both. A question I have that's a bit different than just describing CHAOSS as a whole is, if you're already a tenured professor and you're also a teaching professor, and you also said that you started a master's program in data science, that seems like a ton of work. So how do you find the time to also be involved in the CHAOSS community? And what does that look like for you? What is your involvement? Are you planning everything? Are you the note taker? Are you the ideator? How do you see yourself as being part of CHAOSS while also having this other full-time role?
That's changed over time. Later in 2017, Matt and I got a 1-year startup grant from the Sloan Foundation and just helped to support CHAOSS. That enabled Matt and I to spend some of our research time on the CHAOSS project. So as a professor, the way they usually characterize it on the tenure track is you have 40% of your time for teaching, 40% of your time for research, and 20% of your time for service. And CHAOSS became about 30% of my overall time in that research bucket primarily. So the Sloan Foundation enabled Matt and I to engage fully in the creation of the project. And early on, we shepherded a lot of things and tried to create guardrails so that meetings didn't go completely in random directions, tried to keep people focused on the generation of just a series of standard metrics, because the gap in open source at the very beginning was that everyone wanted to understand health and sustainability. Many people recognized that metrics were part of how we got there, but we also knew that, for example, measuring a commit depending on whose software you used or who you talked to, what you count as a commit could be different. Do you look at the micro level commits? Do you look at whether you have squashed commits or not? How you look at lines of code. Some people counted all the lines. Some people looked at lines added and lines removed. Some people dispensed with all the things that might be white space. So there were many different ways of measuring these common open source constructs. What we did at first was just agree on one way to do it. We never claimed that what is defined in a CHAOSS metric is the right way. But if you follow it and other people follow it, then you're all talking about the same thing. And that was necessary for people to communicate about health across lots of diverse projects in the open source universe. And the time has evolved, and what I do on the CHAOSS project has evolved from there. Now, at this stage, we're very infrequently creating new metrics, right? We have a pool of about 80 metrics that cover a lot of the things. And now we focus on the application of metrics in specific contexts. We have an open source program office working group, an academic open source program office working group. We have a working group focused on data science that Dawn Foster operates. We still have a diversity, equity, and inclusion working group that does event badging and project badging, which has been well received. And that was supported by the Sloan Foundation, as well as a number of grants from GitHub and the Tides Foundation going back several years.
I like the breakdown of 40% teaching, 40% research, 20% service. It sounds like you found a sweet spot where the work that you're doing on CHAOSS is both service and research. So it's really 60% on CHAOSS. Does that sound like an accurate assessment of what you just said?
It's probably more like at this stage, it's pretty close to 50%. There's a lifestyle question about being a university professor as well. I think the advantage of the job is you can pursue whatever you want. The challenge of that is that you have to set your own boundaries with regards to how your time and your life is used. And it is a competitive field. So there aren't many professors that work a 40-hour week. And I don't have that privilege, but I'm enjoying what I do a lot. So that's okay. It's also my hobby to some extent. I've taken up photography in the last 10 years as well. So
photography is awesome.
Yeah.
Also very demanding computationally. It's a lot of time in front of the computer editing things. So
it is.
I feel sorry for you.
Actually, it's funny that I enjoy taking pictures, but I'm a little bit of an introvert. So I'm often in attention when I'm taking pictures of people, which is what I'm usually taking pictures of. The editing is more like meditation for me. It's like a Zen experience because I love the editing. That is, to me, the fun part, because there's the creative process of framing the shot, but then there's the creative process of transforming it into something that communicates. And I enjoy that as well. One of the things that I wanted when Matt and I started working on the CHAOSS project was I'd studied at that point open source for 6 or 7 years. And I'd never actually maintained a piece of open source software or been a maintainer. And as we got in and started using Grimoire Lab, which is fantastic, I harkened back to some of the open collaboration data exchange work that Matt and I were doing. And I recognized that one of the things that researchers need to do is attest to the provenance of the data that is in a paper. And to attest to the provenance of it, you need a level of granular control that is difficult to achieve with OpenSearch, which was Elasticsearch at the very beginning, because it's JSON objects kind of thrown into a bucket. And then there's other software around it that brings that data to fruition to present something to a user. For my research piece, needed something that I could follow the chain. So the pipeline, I could trace it from the APIs that we called all the way through to the way that it was stored in a relational database, and build things that are called foreign keys to assure that when I'm doing the analysis, I have a complete collection of all the things for all the projects that I'm talking about. So that's how Augur was born. So it filled this data need, and it filled my curiosity about what it would be like to maintain a piece of open source software. My reflections 8 years in on maintaining open source software is it takes a lot of work.
So I'm really glad you mentioned that you've been maintaining some software, and it's really cool to hear that Augur is the software that you've been doing. It's also part of CHAOSS. And so everything sort of melds together into one big Mailu for you, right? So you're sort of working on this. You have research coming out of it. Now, what you haven't mentioned yet is teaching. So you obviously have this data science master's that you run, and you also teach people about engineering in general. Do you ever teach your students about open source in particular, or about any of the CHAOSS metrics?
Yeah, I have. I used Augur and CHAOSS metrics pretty actively when I was teaching software engineering, which I haven't in about 2 years now, because it's really kind of a side course in a computer science curriculum. So it's, in many cases, like algorithms, there's just a 3-stage procession through the algorithms courses, and one builds on the other. Software engineering is really the first course that a student in our CS program and in most CS program will take that has an ethic where collaboration is not cheating. So in most CS curriculum, students are expected to do the work on their own. When they work together, that's called cheating. And I was the one who introduced them to this notion that you could work with people and share code and build it together. And that's not cheating. That's kind of the point and what the rest of your life is mostly going to be like. Going back 12, 13 years, when I first started teaching things, I would have to introduce students to Git and GitHub. They weren't familiar with it at all. So it would really begin with, this is Git, this is GitHub. Now, my students come in, they've already got GitHub accounts, they're familiar with Git. And so it becomes a process of showing them how to use it to collaborate. So I don't have to start with the bare bones. I start with, you've all used Git, but you've probably never done a pull request, and almost nobody has actually done a pull request into a project. And so we go through the different ways that you can collaborate using GitHub or GitLab. We go through the differences between branches and forks and how you facilitate collaboration and what kinds of collaboration are supported with each approach. And so I actively used Augur as kind of an example toy project in a sense where they'd go through, they'd learn how to install it, they'd learn how to operate it. That also familiarized the students with how do you engage with open source? How do you participate in a project in a way that makes sense? Because for students, open source is a little bit of an invisible black box. And so I was kind of peeling back the layers of the onion so that they could see how it worked, not just technically, but also socially, so they could get feedback from pull request reviews, understand what that looked like. And then I would kind of sell it to them and explain that when you graduate from college, one of the things an employer is going to look at is your GitHub profile. And if you've made contributions to open source projects, not just one, but a couple, 2 or 3, that really speaks to your ability to figure things out, engage in a productive way, not just technically, but also learning a process and the way that a project operates, and help you get a job. And I think that was a message that you get the students coming back to you who say, that was really helpful for me. That helped me get my internship, or that helped me get my first job. Just, I was the candidate who understood how this really works.
I love that because it also speaks to immediate feedback to your work. So, right? So it must make you feel good to know that people have gotten jobs, and like that, obviously that's always nice, right? As a professor.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
A lot of researchers are distanced from their work. Economists often don't have any place in policy. And so they're just saying, here's what we've noticed. And then someone later may take their work and see it elsewhere. With open source, you have the ability to do research and also to see it change things directly. And I think that CHAOSS as a community of practice has given you a lens on how to see different projects change and move in a way that most professors would only dream of for their research, right? People who work on nematodes aren't going to go around changing the lives of nematodes. They just maybe describe them. Yeah. For the most part. Maybe I'm wrong.
But I don't even know what a nematode is. So
that's okay. I think it's a type of amphibian. It's not.
Okay.
So my question for you is, have you found a sweet spot, you think, where you're able to sort of affect change while also understanding and researching that change?
Yeah, very much. So I've always considered myself a field researcher, an ethnographer of sorts around technology. So being embedded in the culture that I'm studying, the organization type that I'm studying, is central to my approach to research. And obviously, I also have some software skills and an understanding of the use of data for problem solving and understanding what's happening And I think by being able to sort of be part of a community, help create a community, and then also maintain software and help dozens, if not hundreds of organizations make sense of CHAOSS metrics through Augur, I have developed a very rich perspective what it is to do open source. And I think I understand it as a researcher as well as anyone could ever have the opportunity to. I know that I have not written enough of that down or written enough of that up. And that's the challenge of this kind of research and being a maintainer is I have a lot to say or a lot to share that hasn't come out yet.
Yeah, it is difficult. Let me ask a really fun question, which is, do the CHAOSS community metrics, which is normally what CHAOSS community has focused on, understanding community socialization, understanding communities of open source, and then trying to identify how we can learn about them. Do the metrics help make projects more sustainable?
I think they do. I think they do because when you're starting to contribute to open source, you probably pick a project. The project that you pick, it has an influence on whether or not you stick with it. And we know from research that we've done, research I've done with one of the students I had a long time ago, who's now a rock star, far bigger than me, Kelly Blinko at Auckland University in New Zealand. She is way more accomplished than I am at writing about open source and software engineering. One of the things in one of the papers that we did, I think in 2016, is we looked at how do people figure out what project to start with. And turns out people follow the contributors or the maintainers who have the most stars on their project. The stars matter for how people pick a project. And then we know from another piece of research that we did that whether or not your first pull request is accepted has a significant influence on whether or not you ever do a second pull request for that project. So if your first pull request is accepted, then you're likely to contribute a second or a third. And so you sustain yourself through that. The projects can build a maintainer core by finding ways to accept pull requests. We know from work that James Howison at the University of Texas has done that small pull requests are significantly more likely to be accepted than giant pull requests. So the likelihood of a pull request being accepted varies inversely with the number of files and lines of code that are changed. And that's because the bigger the pull request, the more things in it, the more work is pushed onto the maintainer to try to analyze, code review, figure out what the effects of the changes that you made would be. And maintainers, as we know from other research, they face balancing pressures of knowing how much time to spend with it. So we know all these things. When we think about sustainable communities, newcomers have a phenomenally huge effect, I would say there are what I would call leading indicators and trailing indicators. And I think a leading indicator for community health, this is my opinion, I've got some research coming out that will support it. How many newcomers you have coming in over time is a factor in how sustainable your community is. I think on CHAOSS, we've had the benefit of being a kind of a fun community, definitely a welcoming community for both technically skilled and not technically skilled folks. So we've created an ecosystem that I think it's certainly not perfect. However, because of the work of people like Elizabeth Barron, Matt Germonprez, Georg Link, Dawn Foster, Kate Stewart, Brian Profit, Kelly Dolphy, I could go on and on, all the folks at Grimoire Lab, because all these people are sort of supportive and welcoming to newcomers. And we don't have any of obviously everyone's heard about getting yelled at or there being fights on open source projects. And we've been fortunate that we've never had those problems.
A lot of the people you're listing just seem like my friends in some ways, right? Like we've had Elizabeth Barron on, we've had Brian Prophet on, we've had James Howison on here. And it's true that CHAOSS has always seemed to be a very welcoming community, but it's also cool to note that, as well as it being a project, it talks about how to build open source projects, and the projects that it looks at that are good also share the same characteristics, right? So it's easy to get involved, it's easy to be there, it's easy to be more diverse, which is great. That's just really, really cool.
I have not been involved this deeply in any other open source project. And I think that's where my experience differs from like a Brian Prophet, who's written books and probably been engaged. I know he does work with the Apache Foundation. He's been engaged and deeply engaged in dozens of open source projects. And that's because of my multiple different job responsibilities. I've been deeply engaged in one and only one.
Brian has been involved with a lot of projects. I've also been involved with a lot of projects. And let me tell you, they are not all as welcoming as CHAOSS. It's really awesome. I guess a question that I haven't asked a lot of CHAOSS people before is, where has CHAOSS not succeeded? Where is it not overwhelmed your expectations? What's been difficult?
Building a community of people who contribute to the software parts has been more difficult. And I don't know exactly why that is, but it's partly just that the driver for what people want from the project is not pure software. I think over the last 3 or 4 years, the software has become more important because people have wanted to produce metrics at scale, and you need software to do that. So I think Grimoire Lab's seen a boom in interest in the products that they sell through Bitergia. And I know that there have been a growing number of contributors to Augur and users of Augur, again, because organizations, they need these metrics and because they need the data to tell a story, because most C-level or director level executives at companies aren't going to sponsor something unless they understand the return on that investment. They're not going to put a software engineer into a project if they don't understand the return on investment. And you need metrics to tell those stories. And sometimes in organizations like Indeed, where Dwayne O'Brien created some really great metrics for storytelling inside that organization, you have an appreciation and a value of what that storytelling gives you. And it goes on. So it's not like a one-time thing. In other cases, Augur's been used in a number of, I can't say names, but we've been used to sort of analyze the open source assets of companies that are going through mergers and acquisitions or considering mergers and acquisitions. And so that becomes a one-time analysis that people need to see in order to evaluate the suitability of a mate, if you will. And so sometimes it's sustained and sometimes it's not. So at 2 different use cases, both valid uses of CHAOSS. And I think because the metrics themselves are defined and how we used them, how they're to be used in different ways has matured, especially through the work of Dawn Foster and Elizabeth Barron, we have more interest in the software because that's where people come to CHAOSS kind of knowing what the metrics are now. And they're able to figure that out because we tell that story well. And then they often just want to jump to, all right, let me see those metrics for my projects. And that's where the software comes in.
How much do you offer in terms of, let me interpret those metrics well, and let me think about the next steps, right? So if I'm just a generic project and I come to CHAOSS and I say, hey, I want to be a better project, you could throw me a lot of metrics, but then I'm just looking at a dashboard. How do you help them interpret them?
How do we be a better project? I think it's the same kind of experience you might expect if you went to a family reunion and opened with, okay, how can we be a better family? It's almost really, you don't want to approach it that way. You want to approach it like, here's where we think we are and here's what we think we need. Are we right? It's like they're in the dark and they just want to know where the walls are. So we help them find the walls that exist for that room. And those focuses are very different from project to project, and even within projects from year to year, what people want to understand is different. And the one thing that we've not done, but we've been asked to do a lot, is to sort of give folks a dashboard like, this project's red, this project's yellow, this project's green. And we haven't made those value judgments because if you think about it within a family, I've got 5 living siblings and I might give each of them a color, but I might not tell them what color I'd give them. Like my brother, who's a trumper, is probably a red. But
I was thinking it. I'm just saying.
I'm not
my family too, man.
But I'm not going to go to the family reunion and dwell on that, right? I'm going to go to the family reunion knowing, okay, this is the boundaries of where this person is loved and productive in the family. And I don't need to put a color on them. They can just figure it out. And I think it's that way with open source projects where depending on your perspective and your role, you might have different specific things that you would focus on or change. And sometimes a project is aligned around what those things are. And sometimes there are just different corners of a particular project that want to understand different pieces of it, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. It does feel like there's an opportunity for CHAOSS or for some other similar community to help work on how do you affect meaningful change within projects that are labeled red, whatever red means, whether it means there's no newcomers or it means that they have a fascist benevolent dictator for life, or it means something else. Like, right, how do you meaningfully make changes to make communities more sustainable and healthy? Because there's always people who may be interested in that, even as an outsider looking into a project saying, oh, I would contribute to that project, but like the name is offensive and I'm not going to get involved. And then that project loses out on it, right? And I know a project's like that. And so I feel like that would be a logical next step. Do you know if that's in the works? Do you have something like that? Or am I just missing the plot?
No, we do have things like that. The way that we've approached it, and this is happening, I think, in the scientific and academic open source working groups a bit more than elsewhere right now, is to begin to just understand what you need to do to sustain the project. Because those kinds of open source projects, the scientific ones, have a more cyclical level of contribution that often varies according to the funding that they get. And we try to, and let me give you an example, like in the corporatized open source community in the Linux Foundation, everybody understands that having a Linux Foundation there means that I don't have to deal with lawyers to get my governing board structure set up because they have a template for that. It means that I don't have to figure out how to pay for Zoom because I have a central account for that. It means that if I get small amounts of money that can be used by the community, I have an accounting system at the LF for that. So as a corporatized project, there's all this administrative and legal work that occurs through the Linux Foundation that removes ancillary work from the perspective of open source contributors and maintainers and just makes it templated. In scientific open source, there's none of that. In fact, most scientists don't want to be part of a foundation. They don't see the value in that kind of help. And in many cases, not all, building a community isn't something they're interested in. They just want to kind of keep the scientific software that they built for their purposes going far enough into the future so that they can continue to use it to produce papers, which are really the coin in the realm there. And so in those cases, we've built mentoring programs, and we're continuing to build mentoring programs. We've collaborated a good deal with the Chan Zuckerberg Institute over the years, probably going back 6 years, because they sponsor a lot of scientific open source projects that are essential for the conduct of science, but they don't have any other support structure or funding stream. And so they've helped to sort of shore up core things. And I'm talking about like SciPy and NumPy and visualization libraries like Bokeh. CZI has done really good work, just kind of shoring up the peers in these pieces of scientific open source with some funds and a shared organization where they can talk with other scientific open source people.
I'm glad that work is going on. CZI is awesome in what they've donated to open source. LF has some cool stuff that's really great for some projects. I'm not sure I would go as far as saying they're awesome, but they're definitely very useful for a lot of projects that just need help getting over the hurdle of admin. I would put also in that camp things like Open Source Collective, which also runs a lot of stuff for you. There's a whole ton of fiscal hosting in general is really difficult, and it's really great to have those things around for projects that want to just evolve into some other state, not necessarily a linear state, but moving on to more corporatized projects.
Just on the LF, I think just last November, they created a Jupyter Foundation within the LF for Jupyter notebooks, which are kind of core. If there's anything that spans quote unquote all of open source right now, I think it might be Jupyter notebooks, because almost everybody in open source has had to operate one or create one at some point. It's like this middle piece of software that I'm not a programmer, but I can hit play and I can tweak the variables before I hit play.
Physical hosting is really important. part of what's really important about physical hosting is making sure that you're able to help the projects out that ask to be physical hosts. And part of that is figuring out how can we do that better. And it sounds like CHAOSS does a lot of that work. It also sounds like your work has been directly instrumental in helping CHAOSS get to the point where it is useful. And so I'm really grateful, which might be a good place to wrap up because we are running up on time. So, Sean, question I have for you is, besides going to chaos.community, where can we learn more about what you're doing and what you're going to do in the future?
You can look at the project board for the Augur project within CHAOSS. We have a project board that kind of spells out what we're doing. We also have a website I'll send you a link for. Matt and Dawn and Elizabeth and Rhea Zine, who's a new collaborator of ours. We're working on building mentoring programs for scientific open source. That's a big part of where we're going. Just today, Matt and I kind of decided on kind of what we want to accomplish in the next 4 years through CHAOSS, which is really, I think, the use of Augur and Grimoire Lab data and the sort of building data sharing stream that satisfies, because there's so many people who want to make sense of these projects right now on the projects within foundations in the academic research community that still have a hard time getting at the data. So we want to create an environment that is less constrained than the one that we currently operate in. And it's really constrained by the way that Matt and I work with the university is we have to have something called an IRB, Institutional Review Board. It's really important from an ethics perspective. It protects individually identifiable information. It protects individuals, et cetera. And obviously for sharing open source data, there's work that needs to be done to make it more shareable so that more people can look at it and examine it and make sense of it. And I think that's kind of where we're going, is this data infrastructure, kind of back to our OCDX roots, but now with much bigger guns.
So go check that out. Listeners, the links will be in the show notes, where we'll also have a bio of Sean and so forth. I've also dropped a lot of links for other guests we've had on this podcast. People like Dwayne O'Brien was one mentioned recently. I've also had Rhea Alzain on a few podcasts in the Sustained family. Rhea is the best. Hi, Rhea.
Yeah, she's fantastic.
Yeah, she's just amazing. So cool. That's really exciting. Speaking of awesome people, at the end of every episode, we have Spotlight. It's a part of the show where we highlight other people, projects, or things that we think are useful that need a little bit of light shed on them. Today, I wanted to break from my normal routine of choosing something random from my head and instead talk about perhaps an open source project that I used recently. So the project that I used most recently that I was really grateful for is BibTeX Parser, BibTeX Parser, which is a Python library. I have a folder of all of my publications where I have a BST file, like a bib file for each of them, so it can go easily into LaTeX. And what I wanted to do was just build a Munger script that would just take them all and put them into one file called publications.bib. And BibTeX Parser allowed me to do that easily while actually making sure that they're all valid. And that was just really exciting because I didn't have to do any work. This is like a 2-minute script I whipped up, partially using ChatGPT, for which I am grateful. And it was just really nice to have BibTeX Parser around and available and knowing that someone out there wrote it. So whoever you are, nameless maintainers, thank you. Thank you. Sean, what's your spotlight today?
My spotlight is going to be on another person. I want to draw your attention to Stuart Geiger, who is a researcher, professor at University of California, San Diego. Stuart and I go way back to his advisor, and I were at an institute called CSST, Consortium for the Science of Socio-Technical Systems. David Rebes and I were at the first one in 2008 at the University of Michigan. Stuart is David's student, and he wrote a paper describing something he called trace ethnography in 2011 that I built on in 2013 and continue to build on. And it's really about, as a social scientist, making sense of all of this massive data in the universe, not just as data, but as data that is enacted through people, to understand and really bring to life the people who are creating these trace elements, that it's not just some data scientist or computer scientist sitting at their keyboard and drawing conclusions, but we really inform all of the work that we do with social scientific methods as well. And Stuart, he doesn't work in the open source space, but he's certainly been around it, and fantastic human being, really great researcher. If you have any kind of an interest in what we would call computational social science, he's a great person to look up, a great person to follow.
And we've had Stuart on the show before, so I have linked to that. That'll be in the show.
God, I am sharing nothing new.
But I dropped the link to that, which is great. I've also dropped the link to Rhea's podcast, so go check that out on the show notes. And that's right, listeners, this is the part of the episode where I talk really fast. Go to podcast.sustainoss.org to find those show notes. Go to discourse.sustainoss.org to find our discourse where you can talk about things. It's generally a pretty quiet place on the internet. However, that doesn't have to be. If you go talk there, I will probably respond. You could also go to our Mastodon and our LinkedIn and our Blue Sky, where you can interact with Sustain in general. And most importantly, you can go to opencollective.com/SustainOSS and hit the donate button, because there's a reason why we only have one episode coming out a month at the moment, which means we need more funds, which means you should talk to your OSPO or your big head honcho or Bill, your fixer, and see if they could get us more things. That would be really good. Besides that, you can always email all your hate mail to podcast@sustainoss.org or just richard@sustainoss.org. And it doesn't have to be hate mail. It could be love mail, whatever you want. That'd be cool. I'm happy to read it. And very excited to have had Sean on today. Go find Sean on chaos.community and, of course, on the show notes. Sean, thank you so much. Yeah. It was really great to talk to you. I did appreciate it. And best of luck. Keep going. Keep
Great talking with you, Richard. Always happy to talk with the Sustain folks. You're doing great work. We really appreciate it over on Chaos. I think we are pulling in the same direction on different ropes, and it's really great to collaborate with you.